I will introduce our speakers and we will get to this evening's program. So first of all, thank you for braving the icky weather. It's appreciated. It's not the best night to be out. I wanted to thank you for joining us for tonight's installment of the Permanent Exhibition Highlight Series. My name is Dr. Sarah A. Bosch, and I am the Chief Education Programs and Exhibitions Officer here at the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. And I would like to start by thanking our museum members in the audience tonight. Your support is absolutely vital to our mission and allows us to put on programs such as this one. If you are not yet a member, and I'm assuming that every one of you is a member, but if by some aberration we missed one of you, please do visit our membership table in the lobby on your way out to learn more about the benefits of membership. I would also like to thank our community partners for this program. Those would be the Anti-Defamation League Texoma, Congregation Anshe Torah, the Grant Halliburton Foundation, the Legacy Senior Communities, SMU Human Rights Program, and also the World Affairs Council of Dallas and Fort Worth. And we really appreciate your support, because without your support and assistance in promoting tonight's program, again, this program wouldn't have been possible in the greater community. Finally, I'd like to thank our board of directors, who are incredibly supportive of our mission. Could all members of our board who are here tonight please raise your hand? Okay. So we have one amazing board member. Thank you, David Bell. Okay. So what I would like to do also, while I have the mic, is to give special recognition to one of our former board members, Charles Teichman. And he is here tonight with his lovely wife, Joanne. And if you have toured our permanent exhibit, you might have seen two portraits on the third floor landing. There's that big railroad installation, and then next to it are two just gorgeous portraits that were done by the artist Barbara Hines. And they were commissioned by the Teichman family. The portraits depict two people who are honored as righteous among the nations, which is the topic of our discussion this evening. One is Roddie Edmonds, who's the father of our panelist, Chris Edmonds, and the other is Jean Coiffier. And Jean is responsible for having rescued Blima Teichman and her two children, Simon and David. The reason this is significant for us here in this community is that without Mrs. Coiffier's incredible actions, Blima Teichman would not have survived the Holocaust. She would not have reunited with her husband Isaac, and in 1946, she would not have given birth to Charles Teichman, who sits in the audience today. So it is a significant thing that Righteous Among the Nations do. You'll hear from our panelists tonight more about Righteous Among the Nations, but this is just one lesson that hits close to home. So we often discuss the inhumanity of the Holocaust, and tonight we have the opportunity to talk about the other side, the selfless acts of really ordinary people who saw injustice and worked to make this right. The people we will talk about tonight were all ultimately recognized as righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust Memorial Authority. And this recognition, for those of you who don't know, is given to non-Jews, Gentiles, who protected their Jewish neighbors and friends at a time when hostility and indifference prevailed, and often at the risk of losing their own lives and the lives of their family members. Tonight, we are thrilled to welcome three panelists who have a very personal connection to this honor. Starting from my far left, in order of how they are seated, we have Klaus Driessen, whose mother, Mattie Driessen, was recognized as a righteous among the nations. And Klaus generously donated his mother's medal to us a number of years ago. It had pride of place in the old museum, and in the new museum, the big red upstander wall that you see when you enter the lobby has the first artifact that you see on display here, and that is Klaus's mother's medal. Then next we have seated Renata Kessler, whose parents, Fryderyka and Edmund, were hidden by the Kalwinski family. The Kalwinski family, and later they were recognized as a family by Yad Yad Vashem, and we will talk about that as well this evening. And then finally, to my immediate left, we have Pastor Chris Edmonds, whose father, Roddie Edmonds, was recently recognized. And his father, Roddie, and we'll talk about this this evening as well, did more than just receive a medal for being righteous among the nations, for saving more than 20 Jews in his father's unit. He was the sergeant for a POW group. But he also is currently potentially in the running for a Congressional Medal of Honor, and for something else he did. So apparently once you become an upstander, you just don't stop. And it's highly moving, and we'll talk about that as well. If time allows, we'll welcome questions from the audience. At the end of the discussion, please use the note card you were provided to write down your questions, and our staff will come around and collect the cards at the end. Thank you. So, what I wanted to do was start this evening by asking each one of you to talk a bit about the story of your parent or the people who your parents were saved by. And I'll start again just in the order in which you're sitting. Klaus, let's start with your mom, Maddie Driessen, and her relationship with Lily Wolf and the role in her rescue. And I know that that's a huge story, but if you could tell that to us in about 5 minutes.
I actually made some notes, so hopefully that'll work. First, let me thank you all for coming tonight. It was really impressive that so many people would come out on a night like this to come listen to stories of the Holocaust. And thank you, Sarah, for asking me to be a part of this. I appreciate it very, very much. My mother was Mati Driessen. Driessen is a German name, and it means to vex or be annoying. So I thought I'd clarify that at the very beginning. My mother and Lily Wolf, the Jewish lady who my mother hid, went to school together in Cologne. That's where they met. They were both dress designers. They went, Lily was a milliner. Anybody know what a milliner is? Hats. Perfect. All right. And my mother was a designer. And so they formed a business together with a third lady, Mata Schmidt, and had a fairly good business in Cologne. They made dresses for the opera. They made dresses for stage plays, wedding dresses. You come to them and they would make a dress for you. It didn't matter what kind of dress that you wanted. When the Nuremberg laws were passed in 1939, the Jewish lady was forced either to leave the business or close the business down. And they decided that after many, accusations and all of the things that went along with the persecution of Jews, they decided to go ahead and close the business. Lily then was taken to Berlin, and she was made to work in a factory making army uniforms. Then my mother helped her get a visa to get to Austria, thinking Austria would be safe. Well, you know what happened to Austria? It was annexed to Germany and also became Nazi. And so my mother then moved with Lily to Austria. They found an apartment. Lily was forced to move in Austria, it's not really a ghetto, it was the Jewish sector. And she was able to leave during the day, but had to come back at night to spend the night in the Jewish sector. Being a dress designer, she had to wear the yellow star. And when she designed a dress that had 3 buttons, so that when she left the ghetto to go be with my mother and work, she would button this shawl at the bottom. Then when she got out of sight of the guards, very quickly she would unbutton it, button it here, cover up the star, no longer Jewish. She was able to ride the subways, she was able to ride the streetcars, she was able to walk on the sidewalks. And then at night, when she came back, right before she came back into the ghetto, she would unbutton it, and there's her star, and she could go back in. She noticed that the apartments were being emptied, and the night that her apartment was to be emptied, she went to my mother's and said, I can't go back, they're going to send me to a concentration camp. I'm not going to be able, can you hide me? And my mother hid her in her apartment in Vienna for 4.5 years. Let's see. Make sure I got everything. There were some stories that she told about how dangerous it was to hide her. One of them that I never thought of was they had to eat one at a time. And so Lily would eat, and then Mati would eat. And the reason for that was, if there were 2 plates, someone came to the door, who's the other person in the apartment? Who are you hiding? My mother also had to say goodbye to one of her brothers in the hallway. She was afraid to bring him into the apartment because he might notice that there was another person there, that she was hiding a Jew. She said goodbye to him in the hallway, and my uncle then was killed in Stalingrad. So that's the last time she saw him. Said goodbye to him in the hallway because she was hiding a Jewish lady. At the end of the war, Lily then immigrated to the United States, first to New York, and then she came to Dallas. And then my mother and Lily stayed in touch with each other. They were very close. Lily then helped sponsor us to come to America, and that's the reason we came. So it was sort of like my mother hid Lily and helped her, and then when Lily got to America, she helped us, and we were able to come to America.
Okay, Renata, your parents were hidden by a Polish family named Kalwinski, and they were later recognized. Can you tell us a bit about your parents' experiences before and then going into hiding and what that was like? And again, about 5 minutes or so.
Okay. My parents were secular Jews. My father was an attorney before the war broke out in the Polish city of Lvov, which is now Lviv, Ukraine. They were newlyweds. He moved there with my mother, and he practiced law, and everything seemed to go along in a happy manner until the Nazis entered Poland. And I often had asked my father, why didn't you leave? He said people thought it would blow over, that this was just some type of temporary insanity and things would change and go back to normal. But that wasn't the case. And so my father was grabbed in the street and taken away to the Janowska concentration camp to do hard labor. And my mother's family had some servants that she knew that had a place in the country. And she went there and hid. And these people sent their children to the gates of the concentration camp to tell my father where my mother was. So at some point, he escaped. He never really talked about his escape, and I always had the feeling that people were punished and perhaps even killed for his escape, because that's what the Nazis did. They were very cruel and very barbarous, but he did manage to find my mother, and they hid in an attic, just like Anne Frank did with her family. Well, the Ukrainian neighbors, Poland was made up of different ethnic groups, ethnic Germans, Ukrainians, and Poles, and Jews. Well, some Ukrainian neighbors became suspicious, and the people who were hiding my parents and some other Jews in the attic were afraid that they would be exposed. So they knew another Polish farmer not far away that was known for hiding Jews. And somehow they were able to get in touch with him. Now this Polish farmer and his family were part of the resistance movement called the Home army. I think in Polish it's Armia Krajowa, it's pronounced. They were the home army, the resistance movement. And not only did this particular farmer help other Poles, but he also had 24 Jews hidden on his farm. And that was where my parents survived the duration of the war until July of 1944, when they were liberated by the Soviet army. And my father told me it was just the way it was in the movie The Pianist. You could hear them coming into town. He said because they sang these Russian songs, and they sounded like an army of angels. And I hate to call the Soviets angels because they weren't, but that's how it was. That's how it sounded to them. They were their liberators, and they were liberated by the Russian army. And most of the Jews didn't want to stay in Poland. Even though these farmers were very righteous, there were many Poles that turned Jews into the Nazis. But these farmers were very special people. And when Katarzyna Kalwinski, that's the wife of the farmer, was asked by a reporter what gave her the courage to hide Jews, she said she did it because it was the right thing to do. And if I was going to lose my life for hiding Jews, then I was ready to go up on the cross like Jesus. So they did it mainly for spiritual reasons and not for profit, even though people thought it was for profit. And during this time, my father kept a diary of his experiences in the ghetto, in the Janowska concentration camp, and then his escape to the Kalwinski farm. And I've dedicated the last 10 years to having the diary translated and publishing a book about it. I first published it in Poland, and now it's published in English under the title The Wartime Diary of Edmund Kessler. So if you'd like to know more about the story, you can get it on Amazon.
I'll add to Renata's plug that I read Klaus has a long self-written story about his mother's wartime experiences and then her experiences in the United States. And Renata's book is incredibly lyrical. It has a number of sections in it, which we'll get into as we talk tonight, but the diary section from her father is just beautiful. You have to keep reminding yourself that you're reading the diary of a man from 42 to 44 who's under incredible duress, because although he's describing horrible things, the way in which he's describing it is beautiful. Chris also has written a book about his father and his father's actions, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But Chris, for now, your father was in a very different situation than the parents of either Renata or Klaus. Can you tell us more about the action that led to his recognition by Yad Vashem? That's part one. And then part two, so I'll ask you to go instead of for 5 minutes, because there's two things for 10. If it takes that long, it's okay. Would you please also describe the actions he took that led you to pursue a Congressional Medal of Honor for him? Because those are different, and those are also highly significant.
Thank you, Sarah. And that's a little dangerous asking a preacher to just go for 10 minutes.
We can mix religions here, and I will go Old Testament on you, so we'll stop.
That's good. I appreciate that. And I promise not to take up a collection unless you need it. But thank you for being here, all of you. And it's really incredible joy to be on the stage with these two incredible people who I've just met, but their stories are powerful. And so thank you, Klaus. Thank I also want to shout out to Charles and Joanne. My family and I send you our love. We thank you so much for what you've done to extend Dad's legacy, and to the Dallas Holocaust Museum. Wow, what a museum you have. It's probably one of the world's best museums, if not the best. I've been to a lot, so thank you. My father grew up in Knoxville, Tennessee, and in 1941, March of 1941, he left Knoxville probably for the first time and moved on to Fort Jackson in South Carolina, and he joined the Army before Pearl Harbor. He had attended and been a part of junior ROTC all through high school, all 4 years of high school. He knew a little bit about the life of the military, but I don't think he knew much when he got there because it was a whole new world. From there, he advanced quite rapidly as a soldier and became a master sergeant in little more than 22 months. 22 months, less than 2 years, which is phenomenal. And so from there, from Fort Jackson, where he trained a lot of men, their unit was reestablished, and they created a whole new division, the 106th Infantry, and they based them out of Camp Atterbury in Indiana. And that's where he met many of the men who he ultimately fought with in the Battle of the Bulge and was captured with. And some of those men he actually spent time as a POW. And so that's really where the story begins, because those relationships were powerfully bonded before they ever got to Europe and to the war. So Dad and the 106th Infantry were sent to Europe at the German-Belgium border in October of 1944. They went to Europe. They ended up on the border replacing the 2nd Division December 10th of 1944. And they were told they were going to a quiet section, just a place where they could get back and relax and enjoy the Army, if you can enjoy the Army. And they were green. So they 6 days later, the war came to them, and the Battle of the Bulge erupted. And Dad was at the point of the spear where Hitler and the Nazis came through. They held on for 3 days valiantly, bullets against tanks and artillery, but they still held on. Ultimately, though, they were captured. They never surrendered, and that's why I titled the book No Surrender. But they were captured, and they were marched for many days with no food, no water, and ultimately ended up in a first camp called Bad Orb, which was Stalag 9B. And it ultimately became one of the worst POW camps in the German system. And from there, 30 days into their experience there, they were transferred. All the non-commissioned officers were transferred to the 2nd camp. And this is where Dad took the actions that he did. It was January 26, 1945. They were at Ziegenhain, Camp 9A. For the first time in Dad's experience and in the experience of his men who were with him, he was the commanding officer of the Americans in that POW camp. He was the highest ranking non-commissioned officer. He received orders that night on January 26th that the following morning, when all the soldiers were normally to fall out, they just wanted the Jews. Just the Jews. That was the order. Anyone who disobeyed the orders would be shot. Dad immediately turned to his men. He said, "We're not doing that. Tomorrow morning we all fall out." And that's what they did. And so that morning, Major Ziegman, a major from high command who wasn't part of the camp, but he had issued the orders for the Jewish men. He stepped out of the quarters and he was amazed. He was shocked even. Standing before him were all the Americans, nearly 1,300 soldiers, 1,292 soldiers standing in sharp formation. He was irate. He pushed his way over to my father and got up in his face. He said, "They can't all be Jews." To which my father declared, "We're all Jews here." Well, he became enraged. His face turned red. He pulled his pistol. He stuck it into my dad's forehead. He said, "Sergeant, you will order the Jews to step forward or I will shoot you right now." Well, by this point, Dad and his men had faced untold horrors. The brutal battle, the death march to the camps, They were starving to death. Many of the men were losing on average a pound a day. He'd been beaten, shot. He had been interrogated, bitten by dog. I mean, all the horrible things you can think of being a Nazi prisoner. But yet their dad stood, and all of his men stood with him. And he never wavered. And his men never wavered. And finally, with the gun still stuck to my dad's forehead, my dad refused. He said, "Name, rank, and serial number is all you'll get." And the major was irate. And finally, my father looked at him. He said, "Major, you can shoot me, but you'll have to kill all of us because we know who you are. And you'll stand for war crimes when we win this war." I kind of like that part, don't you? And then he added this, "And you will pay." Lester Tannenbaum, 19-year-old staff sergeant who had been with Dad since basic, was standing there, and he was dumbfounded. He couldn't believe. He said, "Your father, he never wavered. He was so brave." And he said, "And his bravery rippled through us. We became brave." And he said the major turned white, and his arm began to shake. And he said almost as suddenly as he pulled the gun out, he dropped the gun to his side. He placed it in his holster. He swung around, and he marched off. And he said he never came back to ask for the Jews again. And he said, "We went back to the barracks and really cheered your father." I said, "I guess you did." So that was just one instance. There's others, and I'll put a plug in. It's in the book. And we may talk about those, but I'm so proud of Dad. It's so like him. He was a strong Christian when he went into the war. He was a strong Christian during the war. He was a strong Christian after the war. He believed in God, and he believed that God was good, and he believed that we should be good to others. And the Germans had no right to do the evil that they were doing. My dad was pretty straight up, and he didn't take anything. According to the POWs I've talked to, they said he didn't take anything off the Germans. And I appreciate that. I'm so glad of that.
And now please talk about why you're working for a Congressional Medal of Honor for your father. I don't mean why philosophically, I mean the action that he took that surrounds that move.
Well, when I first, the way the story really started is my daughter, one of my twin daughters was in Marable College, and her history professor, don't you just love professors, right? Both of these are professors. I gave her and all the students in the class assignment and paired them together with other students and said, pick a family member and do a history project on one of your family members. And they chose Dad. So she came home very excited. We pulled out his Army war journals that he had kept, he never talked about. And so everything that's in the book and what I just shared with you, I did not know any of that until 2013. And so he took it to his grave. But they came home to do the project, and I started helping with them, and that's what sparked me to find out, what happened to Dad over there? I don't even know what happened. That's sad. He would never tell me. And from that, I just searched his name on Google one night, and then his name was in a New York Times article about President Nixon, and it's a long story. But anyway, it's about President Nixon, and there was a man named Lester Tanner from New York, a prominent attorney, who mentions in this article about President Nixon being blackballed from New York City and not having a place to live, and Lester ultimately selling his townhouse to the president back in 1980. He said, there was a master sergeant, my master sergeant, Roddie Edmonds, saved my life. And had it not been for his bravery, I would not have met the president. I read that online one night. So I got to find out. I got to meet Lester. Is he still alive? And so that led me to meet Lester. Lester told me the story. And at in New York, Lester looks at me. He said, Chris, your father's deserving of the Medal of Honor. I said, I think so too. So I came back home to begin that journey. And all of my journey to get Dad a Medal of Honor, which we don't have yet. Isn't the Army kind of slow these days? But anyway, we don't have that yet. But all the things that the Righteous Award and the this book. I never intended to write a book.
Tell people, please, about the way your father, because in my mind, this alone deserves a Congressional Medal of Honor. How your father decided to prevent having the POWs under his command go on a death march, which would have been the death march for all 1,290 of them.
Yeah, it was March 29th, and the American forces were moving fast towards the POW camp, and the Germans gave orders that all nationalities of that POW camp would be marched out the next day. And my father again refused. He told all of his men, he said, "We're not going to do that. We can't march out of here. We'll ultimately die. We're too weak." So they hatched a plan, and he got all of the Americans involved in the plan. So while they were marching the French, the Russian, and the British out of the camp, the Americans refused to go at threat of death. And ultimately, at the end of the day, when the Germans just had to leave, the Americans were coming fast. The German colonel came to my father and he said, "Okay." He threw up his hand and said, "You win. You can have the camp. We're leaving." And they were left alone in the camp. And Lester slaps me on the knee and goes, "That's one of the greatest escapes in World War II, and we didn't go anywhere." So that is the real reason. And there's also, because of his leadership in between the moment where he stood up to the major and also that moment where they defied the Nazis, said, "We're not leaving. You can kill us, but we're not going anywhere." There was so much that went on. I think he deserves the medal for that reason, because of his leadership to save so many men.
Okay, Klaus, and then Renata, and then Chris. Would each of you tell us, how did you learn about your parents' experiences? Was it something you grew up with that you always knew? And Chris has told us a little bit about this. Or is it something that you learned about later in life, and what prompted you to learn?
Lily and Roddie never really discussed their war experiences. I knew that there was an underlying story, but they never really came out and told the whole story. As many of the survivors, many of the soldiers, just kept it to themselves. I didn't really realize until my mother was awarded the medal from Yad Vashem that what it really meant to hide someone and how you put your own life on the line to save someone. That's when I really heard the whole story of how they hit each other, how they had to be so careful not to divulge that they were hiding them. There's a story that Lily told that about halfway through her being hidden in Vienna. It was a beautiful spring day, and she wanted to leave the house, and my mother warned her, "Don't leave. You have to stay." So she said, "No, I'm going to go out and just sit in the sunshine in the park." So in the middle of the day, she's sitting in the park, and a man comes up and says, "Papier, your papers, your identity papers." Well, of course, she didn't have any. Well, the ones that she had a big J on them. It said that she was Jewish. So he said, "Let me have your papers or I'm going to arrest you." And she said, "Well, I don't have them right here. I just stepped out of the apartment. Please, let me go get the papers. I'll be right back." And he had some other things that he needed to do. And he said, "Okay, I'll be right here when you get back." So instead of going back to the apartment, she went around the back way and went back into the apartment and never came out again. And from what I understand, my mother went to go look, and yes, he came back several days looking for her, trying to find her. So once the medal was awarded, that's when they kind of opened up, and they told me some of the stories. I've got a better one at the end that I can tell you.
Renata?
When I was growing up, from the time I was quite a young child.
Mike.
Oh, I'm sorry. From the time I was quite a young child, I realized that I had a very small nuclear family, and I didn't understand why I didn't have grandparents, aunts, uncles, like my other friends did. I didn't understand why. And I asked my parents, and they said, well, there was a war and a lot of people died. And then I asked my parents, how come you survived? And they said, well, because of a kindly Christian farmer who hid your mother and I. Excuse me. We survived, but I never really found out that they actually hid 24 Jews in an underground bunker until after my mother and father had both passed away, and I found the diary in a linen closet. And it was my way of staying connected with them, was to have the diary translated so I could find out what happened to them during the war. And then I went through my mother's papers after she passed away, and I found the address of Mr. Kalwinski, the son who as a teenager did a lot of the hands-on work that it took to hide the Jews. And I wrote to him, and he wrote me a series of letters that his grandson translated, because most of the young people in Poland know English, and he was quite fluent, and he translated. There must have been a series of about 20 letters that went back and forth, and I decided to go to Poland to meet him, and I told him about my father's diary. And then he had also been an inspector of schools, an educator, and together we conceived the idea of publishing my father's diary and his memoir as a lesson for future generations to learn about the Holocaust, that it should not happen again.
Well, as you know, my daughter Lauren was in the history class, and when they started that project, we pulled out Dad's wartime journals. He'd kept two. These were fragile books that he never pulled out, never talked about. And I had read them before when I was a young man, older teenager in college. I'd ask him questions at the time. He said, son, I don't want to talk about it. And he didn't. He never did. So it was just a spark. As I helped him with the project, they created a video. And they used pictures from the internet on the Battle of the Bulge and Nazi POW camps. But the narration that the young man used was word for word out of Dad's diary. When I watched that, it was like I was taken speechless. I said, wow, these men must have really endured something over there. And so that's what sparked me to look into his history. And a friend of mine said, hey, you can get records from the Army. He said, it'll take you a little while, but you can get records from the Army, and you can go online. And so that's what sparked me to go online, type in his name, Master Sergeant Roddie Edmonds, and then ultimately the first link that appeared was that article in the New York Times. So, but Dad never talked about it. My mom never talked about it. Of course, he met my mom several years after the war. As a matter of fact, my dad ended up going back and serving in the Korean War. He stayed in the Guard, and he was called up, and he spent 3 years in Korea. I don't even know about that. So that's another adventure, I guess, that's coming up.
Would each of you please tell us a little bit about what the most difficult part was for each of your parents? Klaus, for you, what was hardest for Maddie and her experiences during this period? And Renata, I mean, your parents were in an underground bunker. Did they talk about what was most difficult for them? And then Chris, again, what was the hardest for Roddie and all of this experience? Starting again.
You have to remember everything was rationed. There was no food. If you wanted food, then you had to go to the Ration Bureau, get a ration card, and then the food was given to you. And the way that they were able to feed Lily was that they would look through the obituaries find someone that had died that fit kind of the description of Lily. And they would make a false card or a ration card and take it and get extra food so that they would have extra food even to survive. One of the things that I asked my mother is, why did you hide her? Why did you hide Lily? And her answer was pretty simple. She was my friend. And you do things for your friends. When they're in need, you help them. And that was a simple, very simple answer. And these two ladies were the ones that raised me. So I was raised in a Christian, Catholic, my mother, and in a Jewish home. So we would celebrate Shabbat on Fridays and go to the synagogue. And the nice part about it was, growing up, I got to celebrate all the holidays. So whenever there was a holiday, I stayed home. So that was the good thing. But I think it really sums it up in saying she was my friend. I couldn't let her suffer, couldn't let her die. And I'll go through this hardship with you, but again, as Renata said, they all thought it would be short-lived. There's no way that this man could stay in power, but obviously he did. So,
Renata.
Conditions in the bunker were really difficult because there wasn't enough food to eat, and very often they had to live off of 600 calories a day. But the Kalwinski family ate exactly what the people they were hiding ate. They said, we don't have two kitchens on the Kalwinski farm. Everybody here eats the same thing. So it was a struggle for life and death for both the Poles and the Jews. And I think there was tremendous fear about being captured. And at one point, there was another family on a nearby farm that was found hiding Jews. And they were all hung in the marketplace. Everyone from the grandparents down to the children with signs on their chests that said, hiding Jews. So at that time, the Jews in the bunker wanted to leave and go out into the forest. And Mr. Kalwinski said, you'll be captured and they'll torture you and you'll talk. So if you die, we all die together. And each of the Jews had arsenic that they were going to take in case of capture, because they didn't want to live to face the reality of being in a concentration camp, because everybody knew what went on there, and that the Jews went up the chimney in smoke, and nobody wanted to face that. So they all had arsenic that they would take in case of capture. And they had some very close calls where the Nazis were already in the house, and they were almost captured. And at that moment, the Russian bombers started flying out of overhead. The Russians were coming, and they were after the Germans. So the Germans ran out of the farmhouse like bats out of hell. And it was just that moment that really saved their lives. It was a very fateful moment. So there was a great deal of fear. I'm sure there's a lot about the story that I don't know. Probably a lot of terrible things that happened that my parents just took to the grave with them because they wanted to protect me, and they didn't want me to live a life full of fear. But unconsciously, we can always read our parents. We always know what they went through. So I don't know that withholding that information from me was really such a good choice. But I found out anyway. Children always find out everything.
Chris?
For my father, he obviously never shared his thoughts. But from his journal, and then from the men who I've met who were with him, because I vicariously lived. I met my father as a young man, as a young leader of men, through these 90-year-old POWs who survived with him. And so from his diary, I can tell you he was scared. He said in his own words, he says, "You get scared, and I mean scared. Don't let anyone tell you that you weren't scared." He also said the saying that there's no atheist in a foxhole is true. So the bombardment, the sheer terror, the violence, the brutality of the war machine that the Germans had when they thrust in, made their last gasp effort towards Antwerp was horrific. I don't know how anyone is sane after experiencing what they did, but yet these men, a lot like my dad, they came back and lived incredible, extraordinary lives. And then he also, he was obviously sheltered when he was growing up in Knoxville, Tennessee. Probably never hung out with Jewish people all that much. I think he did have a couple of Jewish friends in high school, best I can tell. But, he probably thought everybody outside of Knoxville was like people in Knoxville. And so he wrote in his diary, he said, "I've learned men even better than before. Some are good, some are bad, some are better, and some are worse." And so he met the worst of humanity. But he also met the best of humanity. He called them his brave boys. Boys. They were 17, 18, and 19-year-old kids who in an instant became men. And so starvation, that's a clear fact of what they were dealing with. Hopelessness, they defeated hopelessness. And if Dad were to walk into this room right now, he would light this room up and he'd warm your heart. And that's the way he lived. And I have no idea how he came back from what he experienced and lived that way. But I do know from the words of a fellow POW, Skip Friedman, told me, he said, "Chris, we never expected to survive." He said, "And the day we were liberated," he said, "we were reborn." He said, "We died in that camp. And we came out, and he said, tell everyone you see," he said, "the real gift is the gift of life." He said, "It's precious." And he said, "Since that day that I left that camp," he said, "I've never had a bad day, ever." I said, your precious wife, Penny, of 65 years, passed away just 3 years ago." He said, "It was a tough day, but it wasn't a bad day." He said, "I've never had a bad day since I left that camp." And my father never had a bad day. Now, I think because of the starvation, it caused weight problems, because he didn't pass a meal. He didn't pass anything up after he came back, I'm telling you. I found out, I went and met with my cousin who lives in LA. He's an actor. And when my dad came back from the war, he lived with his brother. And so he lived with Raymond's parents. And Raymond was a little boy. He goes, he said, "I loved your father. He was my favorite uncle." But he said, one of the things I remember, he would get extra pieces of food and desserts and pieces of chicken. We'd find them hidden all over the house. And he was going back for more later. So, and the doctors did think that his POW, his starvation and the extreme conditions that he went through probably contributed to his congestive heart failure as well.
Okay, we can keep going with questions up here in discussion, or we can open up to questions from the audience. Are there questions from the audience? I'm happy to go either way.
Can I tell one story, though?
Yes, absolutely.
We want to hear that great
So,
story.
Klaus will tell a story, and I see some hands there. So do you, who have your hands raised, do you have written questions? Okay, so Annie and Spencer and Deanne will collect them, and Klaus will speak.
Okay. Toward the end of the war, the Russians liberated or came into Vienna. Vienna was bombed 12 times, and during one of those bombings, one of the bombs landed near where my mother was being hiding, literally. Russians came in, they heard them coming into the apartment. And first floor, and they were just knocking down doors and coming in and just taking whatever they wanted. Now you have to remember, these are Russians. They're coming from the land, basically. They're farmers. They had not seen indoor plumbing. They were very just drafted and brought into the army, and first time they'd been in the big city. So as they came up the stairs, they kept hearing them breaking in and people screaming and so forth. When they came to my mother's door, the door was ajar. So the Russians thought, oh, they must like us. So they came in, and, what do you say? Welcome. And so they said in broken Russian, German, we'll be back tonight. We want you to cook us a meal. Now you have to understand, they hadn't had anything to eat pretty much during the whole war except for the rations that they were given. So later that night, here come the 4 Russians, the officer and the 3 enlisted men. They've got meat, they've got potatoes, and they've got butter and stuff they hadn't seen during the whole war. Well, they'd stolen it from the others and were bringing it up there, and because they were friendly, cooked for us. So, okay, what do? So you get the oven going and so forth, and then my mother said to one of the Russians, one of the enlisted men, here, go in the bathroom and wash these potatoes. So, not ever seeing indoor plumbing, he didn't know that you had to turn on the sink. He put the potatoes in the toilet and was just scrubbing away. And he reached up to pull this thing, and the potatoes disappeared. And he thought, the Nazis, they're stealing our potatoes. So the first thing he did, he got his gun and literally shot up the toilet because he thought they were stealing their potatoes. And she'd love to tell that story. And it's got to be true. You can't make that up. And that's it.
This first question is for Chris. This audience member wants to know how many Jewish soldiers were among the 1,290 POWs?
There were 200 or more. We're not sure the exact number. We know there were at least 200. And that's a pretty high number. People will always ask, why were there so many Jewish men in that number? Well, toward the end of the war, when after D-Day, they needed lots and lots more men, and there was a program called the ASTP program. And it was the brightest and best soldiers that had been recruited by the Army, and they were taken out of the infantry and put on college campuses, and they were training them to be officers for the next wave of officers. But after D-Day, they needed manpower, so they took the best and the brightest men that they had trained to be officers and slugged them back into the infantry. And I think, and a lot of those were Jewish young men, and I think it's the reason we won the Battle of the Bulge, is because they took the best and the brightest and put them down to be infantrymen, and they became ingenious and innovative when they didn't have weaponry. They found ways to stop the Germans and slow them in their tracks. And so there's a little more than 200 Jewish men.
At one point in your book, you make a calculation as to how many, if I remember correctly, how many descendants there were on the basis of what your father's actions had done. And I remember it was thousands and thousands of men.
Yeah,
and women and children.
Yes, Lester Tanner and I were sitting in his apartment one day, and he just asked me that question: have you thought about your legacy of your father and how many lives he saved? And I said, well, 200 Jewish men in the POW camp, and then really ultimately all 1,275 men at the time, American soldiers. He said, but what about their descendants? I hadn't thought about that. And I told him, I said, well, I hadn't thought about that. He goes, well, I have. He said, probably more than 13,000 people are alive and well today.
Oh, wow.
Because of your father. I was stunned.
Which is the perfect segue for this next question. This person writes, it sounds like any of these stories would make a good motion picture. Have any of you considered this or pursued this? And I'm assuming whoever wrote this is not an agent, just saying. like,
I wrote a play about the Kalwinskis. I've been working on to sort of further develop with them being really the focus and going through the Soviet occupation as well as the Nazi occupation and hiding the Jews. So I've been working on that for a while on a dramatic play, which isn't the same as a motion picture, but who knows?
it's a script.
There was actually a play performed in Vienna called Du bleibst bei mir, You Have to Stay With Me. It was written by a man named Felix Metterer. He contacted me and we corresponded back and forth several times, and the play was produced and put on in Vienna that tells the story of Lily and Mati, how they hit each other.
Thanks to the generosity of the Jewish Foundation for the Righteous, there are 2 documentaries on Dad and his men, and they feature the men that Dad saved, many of the men that Dad saved. There's a shorter documentary, 14 minutes long. It's used for schools. So you can check with the Jewish Foundation for the Righteous for both of these documentaries. There's with that 14-minute documentary, there's a teacher's guide that's almost finished that will, again, be used for schools. And there's a 39-minute documentary, which many churches and synagogues and I've shown it at Holocaust museums as well. It won an honorable mention at the Academy Awards last year. It's a fantastic, both are very, very well done. The 39-minute is Footsteps of My Father, and the other one is Following the Footsteps of My Father. And you can, again, go to the Jewish Foundation for the Righteous website, and you can request to show those in your community. And if you want me to show up and help pass out popcorn, you can call me, and I'll help do that as well. And as we speak, I'm in consultation with a major motion picture company in Hollywood, and we're hoping that it'll be on the big screen in a major motion picture in 4 or 5 years or so. I don't know.
If it gets made, please contact the museum, and we will contact our list to let everybody know that it's coming out and that it's forthcoming. So, okay, here's another question. Renata, after the war, there were many Poles who were not happy with people who hid Jews. Do you know if the Kalwinskis experienced any hatred as a result of their actions?
They never really told me specifically, but I could tell by their behavior that they were afraid. And whenever I've been in Poland to visit them, they didn't want me to speak English in front of the neighbors because they were afraid that the neighbors would get suspicious. And they live in a small city called Gliwice in Poland, in the coal mining area of Poland. And they had the experience, they had something called a działka, which is a piece of land that you rent where you can grow flowers and vegetables, and they had like garden houses built on the działka where they would go and relax, and they would keep their gardening tools, and the houses on their tract of land were set on fire, and they never knew exactly why. If it was just teenage boys vandalizing their property, or whether they were being picked on because news got around that they had hidden Jews. And yes, there still is a lot of anti-Semitism in Poland. It just seems like it's something that doesn't wash away. It's like a stain that won't go away. And even though there are wonderful, righteous people in Poland as well, but there still is a strong, like, right wing. In fact, the right is becoming stronger in Poland, and some of Mr. Kalwinski's grandchildren have left the country and moved further west in Europe to get away of these right-wing elements. And we all know that fascism is coming back. And you would think that after all the Holocaust education we've had and all the never agains, that this could be coming back. It's a very frightening thing, especially for Jews, that anti-Semitism keeps coming back no matter how hard we try to eradicate it. It seems like people are always in need of a scapegoat, and somehow we're the historical target, and we still don't know how to stop it, even though, I'm doing the best I can by participating in programs like this, and we just try to enlighten other people through education. But I don't know if anti-Semitism will ever be eradicated. I hope it will one day, and the human race will evolve and won't need a scapegoat to pick on. Thank you.
Okay, I think we'll wrap up with one final question for each of you. And that question is very short. What do you want us here today to take away from what it was that your parents did or experienced? Klaus, we'll start with you.
Well, I guess be an upstander. When you walk in the museum, the first thing you see is that definition of what an upstander is, and next to it is the medal that I donated to the museum. So I guess fight against intolerance, injustice, and hate. Those are the three things. When I was working, I'm retired now, I used to get letters from, a lot of them came from Canada, and they were always addressed Jew lover. And my secretary would take those, put them on my desk, and one day I got a package. And instead of putting the package on my desk, she said, "Your mail's outside on the front porch, go out and get it," because she thought there was a bomb in it. So even there's so much hatred and so much division, and Renata said it perfectly. The anti-Semitism is on the rise again, not only in Poland, but here in the United States. Even you see it in New York, the rabbis being attacked. So we need to educate our children. We need to let them know that no matter what your religion, what your race, what your gender, who you are, you're a human being, and you need to be treated as such.
Renata?
When I asked Mr. Kalwinski if he thought he would do the same thing again if Hitler times came back, would he do the same thing that his parents did during World War II? And he said to me that if it happened again, he would do the same thing that his parents did between 1942 and 1944, because he said a person's life is only worth what he does for other people.
My father wrote in his diary, he said, "I'm just a little guy." And he was. I could stand up and show you how tall he was. Just a little guy. But we're all little in our own eyes, but he was a big guy. And everyone in this room, though you're ordinary, your life lived well, lived for the sake of others, is extraordinary, even heroic. And so you matter. What you do matters. And the solution to anti-Semitism and hatred of every kind, which is anti-Semitism, is despicable. It's absolutely despicable. But the hatred is in our hearts. The Old Testament tells us, and I don't want to preach, but I do want to preach. But anyway, the Old Testament tells us that the heart is deceitful and desperately wicked. And we all have our prejudices. Every one of us do. There's not a person in here that dislikes somebody a lot because of some reason. And so what we have to do is to decide, just make a decision. When you wake up in the morning, others first, me last. Everybody else counts. I'm second. And I agree with everything they said wholeheartedly. My dad said we are all Jews here, and I'll add to that. We are all humans here. And we need to love and respect one another regardless. You know, I can love you even if I don't like you. And that's what we need. So enjoy life, express love, and embrace God above.
Amen.
Thank you all for joining us this evening.